Awesome, everyone. We'll just wait for the attendees to fill up, and then we'll kick off in about 30 seconds. Cool. Awesome. Well, yeah, hello and welcome to the first ever Interact Virtual Festival, everyone. We've got a great week coming up, packed full of talks from some of the sector's leading thinkers. I'd like to thank everyone involved, our speakers, everyone that's signed up. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Balsamiq, the quick and easy wireframing tool. Before we start this first session, I'd like to let you all know that Interact Virtual Festival is dedicated to Ofer Desh, who sadly passed away earlier this year. Ofer's contribution to design was huge and something that we wanted to recognise. We have a tribute to him on the No Mensa blog, which I urge you all to check out. And yeah, it's an honour to hold this festival in his memory. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many as I can afterwards. And if there's any issues with audio or anything like that, please let us know in the chat function. Yeah, please do say hello to each other there too. So our first talk is from No Mensa's Principal Accessibility Consultant, Alistair Duggin, with his talk, Creating Accessible Digital Experiences, a Strategy, Not a Checklist. Al is going to share insights into what works and what doesn't, and he'll show you how to improve your approach to accessibility. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Al.
Hello. Thanks. Hello. Yeah, I am really excited to be back in the accessibility community and sharing hopefully lots of helpful information. So today, as you said, I'm going to be kind of talking about how to best approach accessibility. I'll be giving a bit of an introduction to kind of like a bit of my experience and kind of what I'm hoping to share with this talk. A really tiny quick bit about what do we mean by accessible, just so that we're all in the same place. We'll then talk a little bit about a common approach to accessibility and kind of what the problems are with that. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, which is how to achieve a truly accessible experience. And then there should be some time at the end for some questions. So I've been working in accessibility for a long time now, and an observation, which I think many people will probably agree with, is that very few organisations approach accessibility in an optimal way and realise its true benefits. So I've been extremely lucky to work at some amazing organisations that really value accessibility and have done some brilliant work. So I've been exposed to kind of lots of different techniques and strategies. I've tried implementing lots of them, and I've learned lots of things on the way. So I think by kind of pulling together different bits of my experience, I'm hoping to kind of share what I think is a good approach. So a little bit about me. So I kind of started in the web industry as a client-side developer at the BBC. I was there for 11 years. The BBC really care about accessibility, so it's amazing to kind of start my career at a place where accessibility was such a priority. I've then worked at places like the Money Advice Service and PensionWise. More recently, I was head of accessibility at Government Digital Service. I was then a senior accessibility consultant at Apple, and I've been at No Mensa now for about 4 months, which I'm incredibly excited about. So I've kind of, at some of those organisations, I've got to work on some amazing projects and have kind of led accessibility projects and have learned lots of things on the way. At the Olympics, at the BBC, I was like the accessibility lead on the Olympics website. And that was a really interesting project because there was a message that came down from a really senior level really early on in the project saying this needs to be accessible. And I kind of stepped into that role and helped a kind of lots of different teams around the BBC help to deliver an accessible experience. I was then at the Money Advice Service where we had a legacy website which wasn't very accessible, and we replaced it with a responsive website and made it accessible whilst doing that. So that involved more just kind of looking after a single team trying to do this rather than multiple teams. I then worked at PensionWise at the Treasury, which was a end-to-end multi-channel service. So that was a fascinating experience, partly because it was following the government designs, the government digital services service manual and user-centered approach, but also because it was multi-channel and it was the actual implementation of a service, not just a website. Then I was, head of accessibility at government digital service, kind of responsible for helping make sure that gov.uk was accessible, that it was an exemplar, and helping to kind of try to raise capability across government. So responsible for running accessibility communities, both within government, but also the London Accessibility Meetup, responsible for trying to raise capability by kind of producing lots of guidance in the service manual and providing training. And then one of the things that I'm really proud of was like our contribution to making sure that the design system was accessible. So there's some of the things that are kind of fed into my strategy. But let's first by think about what do we mean by accessible? So for something to be accessible, it means that it's got no barriers that makes it difficult or impossible for people with specific characteristics to use. So as an example, an accessible website or app would be usable by people without vision, with limited vision, without perception of color, without hearing, with limited hearing, with limited dexterity, with limited or different cognition, and without speech. From a legal perspective, accessibility is about making sure that you're not discriminating against people with disabilities and that they're not being excluded or disadvantaged. From a design perspective, it means that something's been designed really well and that it can be used by the widest possible audience. So let's talk a bit about kind of how accessibility is often approached. I was really fortunate at my time at GDS to be able to lead lots of user research into how teams were approaching accessibility. So we did a big piece of user research to try to understand how different teams across central government were approaching accessibility and the challenges that they were facing. We also did user research into what people thought of the accessibility guidance in the service manual. And for the accessibility regulations, we did user research into how the public sector was approaching accessibility. So lots of valuable insights there, which it kind of backed up a lot of what I had seen in different places that I'd worked, but also when I was leading the London Accessibility Meetup. One of my goals there was to find as many kind of projects or use cases as possible to show best practice. And it's actually really hard to find teams or organizations that are doing accessibility really well. So the types of things that tend to happen is that teams usually don't have a lot of experience or knowledge with regard to accessibility. Unfortunately, like designers and developers don't get taught accessibility in most of the courses that they take, or like when they are learning to become designers and developers. And a result of that is that there's very low familiarity with both accessibility standards and best practice. Most people are confused and overwhelmed by the web content accessibility guidelines, and people are unsure kind of where to go to find reliable accessible examples or solutions. It's also quite common for like there to be an assumption within an organization that the website or the app will be accessible. What you tend to find is that the less accessibility knowledge somebody has, the more confident they are that their product or service will be accessible. There is also a common thing, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where accessibility kind of gets seen as something that we'll do later. Once we've gone live, we'll then look at the accessibility. So as a result of these, it's very, very common for during the design and build, there to be kind of not much consideration for accessibility. What you do find quite a lot is like you'll get a lone accessibility champion that is trying their hardest to kind of make their website or app accessible and trying to kind of encourage other people to do so. But it's kind of an uphill battle when if you're the only person that's kind of beating that drum and accessibility is not being prioritized. So what we kind of see for those organizations or projects that do kind of do accessibility, quite often the effort is towards the end of a project. So when it has been designed and built, it will then be tested, and then any issues found will like go into backlog with the hope of them being fixed. We also see, quite often there's an over-reliance on automated accessibility testing tools. This can lead to, well, automated accessibility testing tools can only find like a very small proportion of accessibility issues. Like the estimate is between like 20 and 30%. So when teams are only using automated testing tools, if their tool is saying that they're not finding any accessibility issues, there'll be an assumption that they have an accessible website. But the fact is that, tools can't find all issues. So it builds this kind of overconfidence about the accessibility of your product. And like the reality is that like accessibility there's a lot to it. And often like deadlines are really tight and it's not prioritized. So it does mean that if issues are found, that the minimum things get fixed. And it's, and we also see that often there's not really a process or a strategy in place to help an organization or a team to achieve accessibility. Well, one of the real challenges is that accessibility is often misunderstood. So quite often you get people thinking, oh, it's just about alt text or color contrast, or it's just about making something work for a screen reader. You hear quite often that people think that they don't have any disabled users, so therefore accessibility is not something that needs to be prioritized, or that there's kind of too much of a constraint on our design to make something fully accessible. Or there's also a really common misconception that well, it's down to the developers to make it accessible, so we can design it how we want, and they'll just they'll make it accessible for us. So the result of these is that more often that they're not like true accessibility is not achieved, and as a result, you will have many frustrated users that have a poor experience. And the reality of the situation is that it's much more difficult and much more expensive to go back and fix accessibility issues at the end of a project rather than making it accessible in the first place. So something that I've kind of seen quite a lot is that when teams do realize that they have accessibility issues, the first thing that they kind of ask for or want is a checklist. And a checklist is, they can be really, really helpful for people that are new to accessibility. As I mentioned earlier, it's very common for people to be very overwhelmed with something like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So providing like a distilled list of things to consider is really, really helpful for people that are starting out in accessibility. However, a checklist will only get you so far. A checklist doesn't really help you kind of understand why something needs to be done. It doesn't kind of help you understand like the benefits of doing something. So more often and not, like, checklists are provided, but then they're not really followed. And even if they were followed, you would only kind of provide a partially accessible solution, because a checklist is never going to get you all the way to a truly accessible experience. So yeah, so it's really common for the benefits of accessibility not to be realized. And I've definitely found throughout my career that when you are thinking about accessibility whilst you're designing and building things, when you are using accessibility as a tool to provide a better experience, you improve the usability for all users, not just for what is sometimes thought to be just a few disabled users. So yeah, accessibility is not about like constraints or constraints to your design. Accessibility absolutely helps you provide a more usable experience to your wider audience. So how do you achieve a truly accessible experience? So I think the first thing that I want to call out is that people don't make things inaccessible on purpose. The fact is that it's very easy to accidentally introduce accessibility to issues, particularly because people tend not to be familiar with the different ways that people interact with websites and apps, and the different access needs that people have. And the reality is that accessibility only happens by design. It won't happen by accident. So if you've not been trying to make your product or service accessible, it's not going to be kind of magically like just made accessible. So yeah, so strategy needs to be put in place to help you get there. I'd also like to kind of have a caveat that there isn't like a one size fits all strategy that will work for, like, here's a strategy, you can just run with this and it will work for your organization. It's more a kind of a collection of strategies that will need to be adapted for an organization. And I'll explain that a bit in a second. So yeah, so the first thing, or I feel one of the most important things, is you need to understand where you are. So this means like, what is the current level of accessibility of your website or your application or your digital estate? If you don't know what the barriers are, yeah, there is normally an assumption that you are quite accessible. So it's only by uncovering the barriers and sharing them that people kind of, yeah, start to understand where you're at. And it's only when you know what the problems are, but also kind of what different types of content you've got. So you know, kind of, you need to understand, yeah, all the different, if you understand your different kind of page types, your different components, are you using a CMS? Are you relying on a third party? Who is responsible for like the content on your website? Do you have dedicated kind of content designers or content creators, or is it the developer that kind of ends up writing the alt text and designers that end up creating the labels for your interface? Are you reliant on a third party to implement your build? Do you use a content management system to publish? It's only by understanding these that you kind of get a really clear picture of where you are and what needs to be done. And by getting this, you're able to communicate to other people what needs to be done, and you can kind of kick your strategy off. So the next most important thing, and this is something that I kind of focused, this was probably my biggest focus when I was at Government Digital Service, was about getting people on board. As I've kind of said, like most people aren't familiar with accessibility, and they're not making things inaccessible by purpose. So it's really important to kind of raise awareness and understanding of accessibility and to build empathy. When people kind of understand the impact of the issues on their websites or apps, people normally really care and want to get them fixed. There's this brilliant hierarchy for motivating accessibility change by WebAIM that kind of shows the most effective ways, like how effective different strategies are for getting people to make things accessible. The least effective is by making people feel guilty or by punishing them. The next is about just requiring them. It's a little bit more effective if you start to reward people, but the most effective ways is to kind of help people really understand about accessibility and to really care about it. So this is things like helping people understand the different sorts of barriers that people can and do face, the impact that it has on them, helping people understand the different ways that people interact with websites and apps. Kind of most people aren't familiar with the range of human capability and all of the different assistive technologies that people can and do use. So yeah, so kind of understanding how accessible your current website or app is and helping people understand what the impact of that is on different people. That's the best way to kind of get people's attention. One of the really, really important things is to kind of get senior buy-in. What is very common in organizations is that there are a few people that really care about accessibility that are doing everything that they can to make things accessible, but they don't have enough time, they don't have enough resource to do it by themselves. So it's really important to kind of get senior buy-in, and this is for two reasons. You want a message to come from kind of senior management saying how important accessibility is to the organization, but they also need to kind of help release time and funds to help people make things accessible. Because yeah, like when you start doing accessibility, it will take you longer to do things. You might need to get support from people to kind of to identify issues and fix things. As time goes on, teams become more self-sufficient, so the costs reduce. But if you don't have senior buy-in, you're always going to have just like a few people struggling and burning out and trying to get things done. The next kind of one of the important things is about creating an accessibility policy. And what I mean by this is agreeing a shared goal and committing to it. So at GDS, we said, right, everything on gov.uk, including transactional services, needs to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to level AA. It needs to work with these assistive technologies, and you need to include people with disabilities in your user research. So that's a really clear thing. That's something that you can help people understand if they have met this requirement or not. It gives people a focus, it gives people a target, it gives a joint understanding of what is acceptable and what is required. What was really positive about government digital service was, as well as having kind of these accessibility requirements, there was lots of other kind of requirements that just led to things being more accessible. So things like needing to use plain language in content, needing to have a consistent user interface, needing to use the component library. These are kind of all parts of that policy that help to ensure that gov.uk and the transactional services meet a really high level of accessibility. Something that's really, really important is providing role-specific responsibilities and resources for training. What you tend to find quite a lot is that quite often people, like a product manager, will think that accessibility is kind of covered, like we've got good designers, good developers, this thing will just be accessible. There's also like a common thing where potentially a designer might think, oh, it's up to the developer to make this accessible. But the fact is that every member of a team does have a role to play in accessibility. Accessibility is absolutely a team effort. So accessibility barriers can occur in the content level, the content layer, the design layer, and the code layer. So it's important to kind of identify who is responsible for those layers, but then also helping those people know as quickly and efficiently understand what they need to do to make their thing accessible. What can happen quite a lot is that everybody gets the same training, and the fact is that what a developer needs to know about making the user interface accessible is potentially different to what a content designer needs to know and what a interaction designer needs to know. There's like some shared knowledge that needs to be there, but there is some content specific knowledge, there's some design specific knowledge, there's some developer specific knowledge, some user research specific knowledge, testing specific knowledge, and product management specific knowledge. Mensa worked really closely with the NHS on their accessibility guidance in the service manual. And they've provided, so the NHS Service Manual contains a dedicated section to accessibility that really clearly kind of lets different disciplines know what they're responsible for, and kind of provides in a distilled and easy to understand way of kind of like what they need to be considering. This is a hugely powerful thing to do. Starting to see more and more kind of organizations publishing these sorts of things. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily just a case of you can just use somebody else's, because roles can be very different in different organizations. So in some organizations, some of the developers might be responsible for the design. You might have organizations where the designers are responsible for some of the content. So yeah, helping understand the roles in your organization and what they're responsible for, and then letting them know what they need to know with regard to accessibility is one of the most efficient ways to kind of get people up to speed. So at GDS, we provided lots of guidance in the service manual. We also kind of set up lots of training for individual disciplines. These are all really positive, helpful things. Something that you also need to do is to provide support. The reality is that somebody attending a course doesn't automatically make them an accessibility expert. They will still have questions. One of the things that we found when we did our user research was that how frustrating people found it, like finding accessible examples and finding kind of solutions. If people struggle to get an answer to their question or find a solution quickly, there's either a really high chance that they'll just give up and not do it, or they'll implement something that is not as effective as it could be. So I've kind of worked in a few different ways of providing this support. When I was at the Money Advice Service, we utilized a accessibility kind of agency to do our testing, but also to provide answers for any questions that people had. Also did this at the BBC. When I was at GDS, we built up an accessibility team that had accessibility specialists in it, and we started like a Google group where people could ask questions, and as well as the community responding to those questions, accessibility specialists could also respond to those questions. So it's really like, if people are struggling to get answers, and the fact is it can be really hard to find the right answer on the web. There's so much accessibility information out there on the web, but half of it's not reliable. Well, more than half of it's not reliable, and it can be quite hard to find the answer to the specific thing that you're looking for. This kind of ties into building a community, seeing lots and lots more organizations that are kind of doing this. My approach at Government Digital Service was first to identify accessibility champions across the organization. The fact is that if you are building an accessibility team, you will never be able to build a team kind of big enough to do everything. You want to have really enthusiastic accessibility people across an organization, and you want to kind of support them to do your work for you, like to help people across the organization. You also kind of want to bring together people and connect them. You'll often find in an organization that somebody's struggling with something, but someone else on another team has already done that, or they've already got a solution. So what we found really, really helpful at GDS was we built a cross-government accessibility community. The main kind of vehicle for this was a Google group. It was a place where people could ask questions, but it was also a place where we could kind of share best practice, promote guidance that had just come out, look at the different questions that people were asking, and then use those insights to improve the resources and the training that we were providing. So building a community is hugely helpful in your efforts to make things accessible. One of the key things is to kind of get people designing and building with accessibility in mind, rather than design and build how you want and then get it tested and then fix it. So you absolutely want people to be trying to reach web accessibility guidelines from the start. Accessibility guidelines, they're kind of distilled best practices that you need to do to achieve a minimum level of accessibility. I see the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as a tool to help you make something accessible rather than being your goal. Your goal is not just to meet WCAG, your goal is to provide a truly accessible experience. Something that I found really helpful to kind of share with people, or kind of to help people understand accessibility a bit better, is to break it down into, you want to kind of design and build something which fundamentally is accessible by default. So you want as many people as possible to be able to use it without having to modify it or to use assistive technology. So these are things like using plain language, having good color contrast, having large typography, having kind of consistent labels and things across your site. There are some design decisions that if you make them, just more people will be able to use your site without having to do anything else. So really good example is you could choose to pick small pale text, or you could pick larger darker text. If you pick larger darker text, more people are going to be able to use your website without having to figure out how to make the text bigger or darker. The next thing you want to be considering is accessible alternatives. So there will be there'll be things that if you don't provide an alternative, there'll be a barrier for some people. So one of the things that you want to do is to identify where people are going to be excluded. So a really good example is a video. If you have a video and you don't have captions, then people that can't hear your audio content in that video aren't going to be able to use that video. So you need to provide some captions. You might have something like a Google Map, which is great for lots of people, but for people that can't see the map, for people that can't drag the interface, they're not going to be able to use that map. So you'll need to come up with some kind of alternative mechanism for people to get the information that you are using that map for. The next thing that you want to think about is allowing customization. So once you've got these accessible defaults, once you've got these alternatives, can people customize the experience? So can somebody turn on or off the captions? Can somebody increase the font size? Can somebody increase the spacing of the text or change the font? And the other thing that you want to be doing is kind of making sure that things are compatible with assistive technologies. And this is where kind of coding best practices are really, really important. If you're thinking about these kind of 4 different layers of accessibility, that's how you end up providing a truly accessible experience. So the next thing that you want to be doing is embedding accessibility into your process. So you absolutely want to move away from this place where accessibility kind of just gets checked at the end. If your process kind of includes a discovery, an alpha, a beta, and a live, you want to be thinking about accessibility during the discovery and the alpha. You don't want to wait until beta. If you don't follow that kind of process, if it's more about kind of a designer designing something and then that gets given to a developer, kind of it makes sense to be checking the accessibility of those designs before they go to the developers. And what you want to be doing as much as possible is empowering the people on your teams to be making accessible decisions and testing for accessibility themselves. So you want your designers to be testing the color contrast themselves. You want them potentially to be able to do a heuristic evaluation of their design to kind of identify any barriers that might exist before it goes to a developer. Equally, you want your developers to be kind of running an automated tool, testing with a keyboard, making sure that when they increase the font size that it works. You want this to be happening whilst people are designing and building a thing rather than at the end. One of the highest impact things that you can do is kind of building accessibility into your assets. So if you have like a brand or a content style guide, you absolutely want to be kind of baking accessibility into that. If you have a service manual, or if you have kind of guidance and intranet, if you have like a playbook on how to do things, again, you want to bake accessibility into that. So the place that people go to find out how to do things, include accessibility in that. You also want to do things like if you create PowerPoint presentations, if you distribute PDFs or Word documents, you want to kind of have templates that have accessibility built into them. And things like pattern libraries and design systems, kind of building accessibility into reusable things is one of the most effective ways to kind of efficiently make things accessible. So the gov.uk design system is a really good example. So it has like the typography and the colors, which are all accessible. It has kind of different components like a disclosure widget, form elements, error messages. Accessibility is baked into these. It's also got kind of page templates and patterns for kind of transactional services. And these have been made accessible, which means that people across the organizations that use these kind of can get accessibility for free rather than reinventing the wheel and trying to figure it out for themselves. So yeah, I kind of can't can't say any more strongly yet how important it is to bake accessibility into your reusable assets, or if you don't have reusable assets, to create reusable assets and make them accessible. One of the other things that needs to be part of your strategy is kind of confirming that things are accessible. We've kind of talked about raising capability, getting people to do testing themselves, but you also are kind of, you want to make sure that the thing is really accessible. It takes time for people to build the skill and experience to thoroughly test things themselves. So yeah, it's important to test things are accessible by somebody that knows accessibility really well. It might not be every single thing that you're testing, but you want to be testing some of it so that you have a level of confidence of, yes, stuff that's been created is accessible, or yeah, there's still more that the teams need to learn because it's they're not capable of making it fully accessible by themselves yet. Also, if you're doing usability testing, which hopefully you are, then you should absolutely be including people with access needs in your usability testing, and you should also be inviting feedback from people with disabilities. So a really good example was for the BBC weather app that I worked on. During the beta, we reached out to a few assistive technology users that we knew. We asked them to kind of trial the app for a couple of weeks during the beta period, and they came back with loads of helpful insights and things that we needed to fix to make it more accessible. There's only a few more of these. I'm just seeing the time, so we'll speed up a tiny bit. So there's also a thing about kind of tracking priorities and issues. If you're not putting accessibility issues into a bug tracking system, the issues will get lost. It's also a really good way to kind of provide visibility of the number of issues, both to the teams that are working on products, but also to more senior managers. It's really helpful to kind of, or important to provide a level of impact for an issue. Not all accessibility issues are equal. Some will be a complete blocker, some will be a mild frustration. You want to kind of identify those blockers and prioritize fixing those blockers. It can also be really helpful to categorize the bugs or the issues that you find. So this will kind of help you see, like, do we keep making problems in our content? Is it always the error messages that we've got problems with? We keep having problems with alternative text. If you're categorizing things, you can start to see patterns, and again, you can improve your training and your resources to help in the places that need the most help. There's also a thing about tracking are issues being fixed. Just because you put an issue in a bug tracker doesn't mean it will get scheduled and fixed. So if you are seeing blockers not being fixed, you want to kind of encourage or push people to get them fixed. A lot of what I've been talking about here has kind of been about teams building things, but we know lots and lots of organizations rely on procurement. So they will either procure, like get a team to help them build something, or they'll buy something from a provider. It's really important to include accessibility in your requirements. It's really important to kind of ask questions to understand the capability of an organization. It's very common for providers to exaggerate the accessibility of a product or their ability to make something accessible. So again, it's really important to actually confirm that the thing is accessible. Kind of makes a lot more sense to put to ask the provider to get it audited and confirm that it's accessible, rather than you having to do that testing yourself. One of the other big things that definitely learned from working at GDS is about making things as easy as possible for people. Anything that is hard, people are less likely to do. So we've talked about kind of distilling information into checklists. We've talked about reusable things in pattern libraries. We talked a bit about kind of document templates, but there's also things like do people have the software that they need to make things accessible? So like, can people install a browser with accessibility testing tools in it to help them do their job? If somebody is creating PDFs, do they have Adobe Acrobat so that they can check the accessibility and fix accessibility problems? Do designers and developers have access to assistive technology so that they can easily test things themselves? The Empathy Lab at GDS was in, like, part of it was for educational and awareness purposes. The other purpose was just provide the tools so that people can do the testing really easily. I've also already talked a little bit about this, but it's about kind of using insights to make improvements. So if you have a community where people are asking questions, if you're tracking the issues that are being found, if you are running training and collecting feedback during that training, this is all information that you can use to improve your resources and your training and your processes. There's a thing around monitoring your progress. Things like how many community members you've got, how many questions are being asked, how many issues are being fixed and found, how many complaints are being made. These are kind of metrics that will help you see how you're doing at a particular point in time. And if you're tracking these over time, you can see if you are improving or not. And if you're not improving, then there are things that you need to do to try to improve it. And then finally, a big thing is about making accessibility part of people's jobs. There's some really simple things that you can do, like include accessibility in job specs. When people on board in your organization, talk to them about accessibility, point them at the accessibility guidance that you've got, show them the policy that you've got, sign them up for training, those sorts of things. Include accessibility in people's objectives and performance reviews. You can include it in career progression. So if somebody wants to move from a junior developer to a mid-level developer, you can make it a requirement that they need to know about semantic HTML and how to use ARIA and things like that, and also make it possible for people to kind of sign up for training for accessibility. So hopefully that was kind of helpful. That's a bit of a whirlwind tour of like how I see a really effective way to help kind of make things accessible. We have some time for questions.
Awesome, thanks so much, Alistair. There's lots of things to think about there. Yeah, we have got time for a few questions. So Lassie asks, how long would you expect it to take from kicking off accessibility efforts, if the starting place is not that great, before they can proceed on their own? So I'm guessing kind of, before they can kind of confidently say they're kind of designing.
Well, I guess I guess it goes back to kind of understanding your organization. So like if you look at something like gov.uk, that is like a static website. You might have a different organization that creates like dynamic applications and uses a JavaScript framework. Things like that will be harder to make accessible from a code perspective. So it will take people longer to get there. I think like you can get people interested and get people doing great accessibility things quite quickly. To become kind of real experts it just takes time and experience. Yeah, really difficult question to answer. I think it also depends on the skill set and the experience of your team. So a really good example was the design system team on gov.uk. So before the design system, we did some work where we evaluated the accessibility of the predecessor, which was called gov.uk Elements, and we kind of surfaced what the problems were. And we kind of provided training and support to the team that were making the new design system. And within a really short time, they became like really proficient and really kind of good at making the design system accessible. So yeah, so that's an example of it happening quickly, but it could definitely be longer depending on the skill set and the complexity of your service or your application.
Awesome, thank you very much. So so Alex asks, he says, Alistair, very insightful so far. Can you explain the differences for you between accessible design and inclusive design?
Yeah, it's kind of semantics, I guess. So some people think that accessibility is about meeting guidelines, testing something and remediating, whereas inclusive design is potentially broader than just disability and thinking about it throughout the life cycle. If I'm honest, I kind of consider accessibility and inclusive design as the same thing. I think you get some people that think they're the same thing, and you get some people that think they're very different. Yeah, there's not really a clear definition of the two. I think inclusive design definitely helps you make something accessible. I think the process of inclusive design is what you need to be doing. We kind of want to move away from that thing of just test and remediate. But yeah, not sure if that helps.
Awesome, thank you. I think we got time for one more question. There's a few people asking about your recommended training program.
Okay, so yeah, so there's lots. There are lots of things out there. So so I guess it depends on the discipline. Like if you're a developer wanting to know the basics, there's a Google Web Fundamentals course on Udacity, which is really good. The University of Southampton do a really good kind of general introduction to accessibility, which is on, is it FutureLearn? I can share some, I can tweet some links to some helpful free resources out there. So sometimes what you find is that it can be more helpful to kind of get bespoke training for the roles and responsibilities that you have within your organization. But yeah, I can definitely share a load of really helpful free stuff that is out there.
Awesome, thank you. So I think, yeah, we've probably got time for just one more. So Raina asks, do you know of any good platforms or services for recruiting user research participants with accessibility needs?
There's a couple of agencies that specialize in it, but I can't recall their names off the top of my head. Again, I can try to remember them and tweet them. Yeah, I can, top of my head, I'm struggling to remember, but I can do some digging and I can tweet some stuff.
Awesome, thank you very much. I think that's all we've got time for now. Al, you're probably going to hate me for this because you're going to be bombarded with tweets, but anyone that wants to ask, anyone that wants to ask our questions over Twitter, your Twitter account is @DougBoticus, is that right?
Yes, there we go.
Awesome, great. So, yeah, if anyone wants any questions answered, please get in touch with Al over on Twitter or on LinkedIn or the No Mentor account or Interact accounts, and we can make sure they're answered for you. But yeah, thanks very much, Al, and thanks everyone that tuned in. Our next session is at 1 o'clock, which is a panel discussion on diversity and inclusion in design. Sign up via Eventbrite, and yeah, hopefully see some of you there. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just